able to do this now?
In recent years, there has been a unification of internal opinions and the establishment of institutional structures within the liberated areas of Syria. This institutionalization included the restructuring within military factions. They entered unified training camps and developed a sense of discipline. This discipline allowed them, with God's guidance, to engage in a battle in an organized manner. The progress and execution of plans have been swift, with clear communication and adherence to commands. They stop where they should stop and withdraw where they should withdraw. The revolution has transitioned from chaos and randomness to a state of order, both in civil and institutional matters and in military operations.
That is CNN talking to a terrorist. Jelani is head of the Al Qaeda branch in Syria. Now, this man is effectively akin to ISIS, and they are treating him as if he is a diversity-friendly jihadist, as they called him. They are trying to make it as if he is reformed. He's become a moderate terrorist. And so, despite the fact that he's on the terrorist watch list for the United States, the US pretends as if they're perfectly unaware, and they use him as a battering ram in a similar way that they use the Ukrainians. In this case, instead of hitting Russia, they're trying to take down the Syrian government. There's a part in that that is just fantastic. He said this discipline, because what she's asking him is basically, how did you change? How did you become this military force that you guys are now, that you're able to basically knock down the Syrian military and go rampaging through Syria, chopping off the heads of children? And he said, this discipline with God's guidance. Okay, yeah, man, God can guide you in all sorts of ways. Where are you getting the hardware? Where are you getting the equipment? Where are you getting the guns and the bullets? Who's paying you? Who's paying your salaries? It's that part. You're acting like God gave us this so-and-so. God didn't give you anything. You got training, money, equipment from the US, Turkey, and whatever other Gulf state was involved in giving you this money. I suspect Qatar. I guess my point is the US, Israel, and Turkey are the main benefactors of this terrorist group and this terrorist organization with NATO weapons to back him as they finally try to take down the Syrian government. The recent news, Daraa has fallen. And it is shocking that these cities are falling back to back to back in this particular way. If you think, in fact, before I get to that part, this is the map. This. Because the first thing I thought was, okay, well, what are we looking at in regards to the battlefield? Yesterday, or day before yesterday, Aleppo fell. Yesterday, Hama fell. Apparently, there are two fronts that have opened. There's a northern front and there's a southern front. In the southern front, Daraa collapsed. And the southern front is this tiny circle. Oh, where is it? It's down here somewhere. In fact, let's just do this. All right. So Daraa is down right here. If we pull out, we can see Damascus. So there's a bit of way to get from Daraa to Damascus. I suppose this is the southern front. From the northern front, Hama has been taken. The people and homes have started to flee in order to escape because they know it's coming. I don't necessarily know where they're going to run to, but they have started to leave and evacuate in a haste. Damascus, the capital, is close. Now, what's astonishing in all of this is the speed at which this is taking place. Also, the fact that the Syrian army seemed to have been caught completely unaware. This is a force of like 100,000 people with huge amounts of equipment and everything else associated with it. They talked about it online and was bragging about it apparently in Telegram channels and everything else. And yet, it seems that the Syrian government was caught completely unaware, and it seems that the Syrian military is fundamentally evaporating. It's very strange. Now, the Syrian military has said that they haven't necessarily left, and they may be setting up defensive positions in various parts of the country. That may be true. But the speed and the rapidity of the events has been rather shocking, to put it mildly. Regardless of the propaganda that the West is using to justify this kind of blatant, brazen overthrow of the Syrian government, not to mention the killing that's involved in this process, that's secondary to the point of the defense that you would have thought would have been there. I mean, after all, it wasn't like the war ended. You had this kind of conflict where the U.S. was holding on to the oil and was still working with various terrorist groups in the region, specifically Idlib. Idlib is a cancerous, festering wound that even the UN mentioned was 30 to 40,000 terrorists living in that location, growing, and apparently growing to the point of growing training and everything else, where they could basically attack the Syrian government. Syria is under intense pressure, and everybody that I brought on to talk about what is taking place on the ground, no capability of taking back Idlib. And the question at this point is whether or not the government will be able to withstand the force that is being applied to the government. Now, if Syria falls, there will be all sorts of consequences. A, Hezbollah. B, Gaza. C, the Russians. D, the Iranians. So you understand the significance of Syria in the context of this kind of global war, hybrid war that is taking place in regards to the U.S. trying to, A, go after Russia, but B, also settle this idea of having routes going from Syria into Israel. Erdogan has been trying to pretend as if he has nothing to do with this. And the Russians, because they want to be able to negotiate with Erdogan to get his dogs back in line, are not blaming him directly for this. Even when Lavrov was talking to Tucker Carlson, Erdogan never came out of his mouth, despite the fact that it is very clear that Erdogan is directly involved in this. Erdogan, for the longest time, kept talking about this like, well, he needs to talk to the Syrian people. It's the Syrian people that are flipping out about this, acting as if this is some kind of civil war. This is not a civil war. Syrians, even the Syrians that are against the Assad government, that don't like the Assad government, do not want to be under this modern day Nazi party, meaning the terrorists that we're backing. You have a country that is moderate and is inclusive of all sorts of religion. Idlib province was not a haven for multiculturalism. It just wasn't. It was a terrorist haven. And they bled out any other group that didn't necessarily meet with their brand of Islam. They are going to do the exact same thing there. The residents are terrified, and they're terrified for a reason. If indeed those residents, if this was just Syrians who had issues, and some of these people are Syrians, don't get me wrong, but this idea that they're diversity friendly is nonsense. If indeed the residents of Syria, if this was some kind of uprising, if this was some kind of you know, pro-democracy terrorist group that was going to be, and the people knew them to be inclusive and everything else, then why are they fleeing? Why are normal Syrians fleeing? They're fleeing because they don't necessarily want to be under a terrorist state. And they know what that terrorist state is, considering that this was the group of terrorists that they were fighting back in 2011 and that they were dying and being killed and beheaded by these terrorist groups. So they clearly understand what is at stake. And they know that their lives are at stake. Erdogan, who pretended as if he had nothing to do with this, couldn't withhold his glee, and has finally come out and wished the terrorists well. And wished them well in going to Damascus, basically to overthrow the Syrian government. Now, I have no idea what leverage Putin thinks he has in this in talking to Erdogan. Erdogan clearly stabbed him and Iran in the back. They had the Astana agreements that they thought, on some level, I would imagine, if not put this to bed, at the very least, had a certain level of stability associated with it. And I don't know if they trusted Erdogan or not, but he took the biggest knife that he could find and he stabbed it in Putin's sternum in this very situation. And now his band of terrorists, at the very least in Erdogan's mind, most likely, if we can knock it over, I don't have to negotiate. Meaning this is a show of power more than anything else. You could say that Putin was tricked, fair enough. You could say he was outsmarted, fair enough. However you want to look at it, Erdogan lied. Or at the very least, trick, lie, whatever you want to call it. Erdogan got over on him. And now there's this question. Now leave the video at this. Whether or not Damascus holds, whether or not the Russians that are apparently rushing to Syria in order to try to solidify Syria once again, whether or not they can get that equipment and manpower there fast enough to withhold, or for that matter, prop up the Syrian government. And there's even a question of whether or not they have the forces to spare in this situation. I imagine that answer is going to be yes, because Syria is an important place to hold. But obviously, if it's between Ukraine and Syria, obviously it's going to be Ukraine. But let's be very clear, in the global context, Syria is important to the Russians from a strategic sense. I have a hard time believing they would let it collapse. But that's assuming they can stop it from collapsing, considering the speed at which the terrorists are advancing. So, it is a dark day for the people living in Daraa. It's a dark day for the people living in those states that the terrorists have basically knocked over. And there's a question looming whether or not Damascus can hold. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Have a good one, all.